Now, let's talk about HTTP in more detail. So, HTTP is a TCP based application and it's listening to port 80. So, it's TCP application and it's listening on port 80. Okay, and it's also web based. And client sends request, it builds a connection and exchange data. Now, assuming that the client has already sent the initial connection, the web server what provides our contents. Okay, and these contents are delivered by the web page. So web page or web pages, okay, and delivers contents. All right. Also, these contents can be static, dynamic, or interactive. So static, dynamic, or interactive. Now, to give you a base example, the static web pages, these are the simple web pages that you see, simple text, simple image. You don't need to log in, okay, because it's not pulling information from the database. Okay, so basically, it's just a web page that is very simple, and it doesn't change. Okay, meaning if you go to that page, okay, and on the next days or next years or next months, it would look the same. Okay, and again, there's no login information, there's no user information, etc. Now, the dynamic web pages, these are the most common one. Okay, where you need to log in and from there you will see your profile as a user. What else? E-commerce, you don't only need to log in, it also has a shopping cart and it also gives you information based on your purchase history, etc. What else? Social media application, of course you also need to log in and you also have interaction with many different types of people. Okay, some of your friends, some are not your friends. Anyway, speaking of interaction, okay, you see this interactive web pages. These are the web pages where you can interact to people. Okay, and the communication may vary from messages or chat. It can also be via video or via audio only. Okay, so that is interactive. So some social media application or web-based applications are not just dynamic web pages but also interactive web pages. Okay, now HTTP has many attributes. First one is the client server based application. So let me just highlight client server based applications. So how does it work? Well, what I'm gonna do is I will draw the client. Okay, so this is our client and this will be our server. Okay, server. Now let's move the client a little closer to the server. There you go. And I'm gonna add a communication here, okay, a connection from the client or to the server. Now, the client and server, this is what makes HTTP or web-based application works. Okay, both client and the server must speak HTTP, so they must speak both HTTP. Okay, and that is, I would say, the primary requirement. From the client side, we have tools to communicate to HTTP or web server. Okay, and one of the most common would be is web browser. These are Mozilla Firefox, Google Chrome, Microsoft Edge, and so forth. We also have CLI based such as curl. Okay, we're not gonna talk about curl that much because it's not very common. Now, on the client side, since we're talking about web browser is the most common, we will talk about some of the components of the web browser in a bit. Okay, so I will just add the web browser here. All right, now Again, on the client side, all you need to have is a web browser. Curl, it's optional. Not too many people use curl. All right, on the web server side, we have an operating system. Okay, it can be Linux, it can be Windows, but the most important is the service that it's running. So this is your web server, right? And the web server, to make it a real web server, it's not only an operating system, there must be a service that runs. And this service or services, these are what we call the web services. So basically, it's a web server software. The best examples are Apache, probably the most number, very common because it has been available for so many years or already decades. What else? We also have IIS, and this is Microsoft base. Okay, not as common as Apache, but again, like Apache, it's also been available for decades. What else? We also have the most advanced Nginx. I would say for the past few years, this has become more and more common. Probably more common than Apache, okay, especially on the cloud environment. Okay, so we already have a client, we already have a server. Now, on the client side, like what I mentioned, we have a web browser. Okay, and the web browser, it has many components. Okay, web browser has what we call the address bar, and probably you've already seen this. Once you open your web browser, you will see like a field on the top of your web browser application. Okay, again, this is what we call the address bar. And inside the address bar, this is where you specify the destination. Okay, and how you do it is like this. Let me change the color. So you type http colon slash slash, and then you have the URL. Now URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator, and basically this is your destination. Okay, destination. Okay, this is your website. Okay, and it can be IP based. Okay, if you're in a testing environment or you're in a internal organization, it's also possible that you are only using IP based on specifying the URL. But again, it's not very common. You can also use name, but the most common, especially in a public network such as the internet, is the fully qualified domain name. Now, the fully qualified domain name, these are, of course, the websites we know. Okay, fully qualified domain name, these are the websites we know, such as www.f5.com. What else? www.zurian.com, google.com, and many others. Okay, now if you look at these are names, right? Okay, this is what we input, this is what we specify in our web browser. Now, based from our previous discussion, right, there's a DNS that translates those names to an IP address. But before we talk about that, let's talk about first our web browser. So we have this URL, right? We have this URL. Again, this is the destination, IP, fully qualified domain, etc. Now, I want to highlight this. This is HTTP. We specified HTTP. This means that this web browser wants to communicate via TCP port 80, okay? And this is the default. As a matter of fact, even if you skip the HTTP colon slash slash, even if you just specify the URL, just URL like www.f5.com or www.zurian.com, etc., it will still initiate HTTP request. So meaning HTTP colon slash slash is not mandatory, okay? Also take note that it's not only HTTP or TCP port 80 that can be used in our web browser. As a matter of fact, you can also use HTTPS. If you use HTTPS, actually you just add S or append S with HTTP. What will happen is it will use a more secured web-based application called, well, sometimes people call it SSL, but also TLS. But basically, it's HTTPS web-based application, and it's not listening on TCP port 80. It's listening to TCP port 443. Again, it's more secured because the transaction is encrypted. Okay. Now let's specify this is the web browser, and let's go back to our fully qualified domain. Now, in our previous discussion, DNS, okay, the domain name system, this is the server that translate names to IP address. So as you can see here, these names will be translated to IP. Okay. Now, once these names are translated to IP, okay, the HTTP transaction, or not just a HTTP transaction, the entire network transaction will begin. And how does it begin? Okay, remember the IP based communication we talked about on the previous video? Here's how it works. Since we are already talking about web or HTTP in more detail, here's how it works. So before it sends HTTP transaction or HTTP request, what it will do is it will send, on the lower levels. Okay, so let's jump to the TCP of the OSI layer. Now, I would like also to specify first the port. This is the TCP port 80. Now, assuming that the client already know this IP address, it already translated, or I mean the DNS server already translated, it will start sending what we call TCP SYN. Okay, this is the part of the three-way handshake. So the TCP SYN, how it works is, it's more of a testing, like the client asking the web server, hey, is your TCP port 80 open? Is it active? Now, if the client has an active TCP port 80, it may reply with what we call the TCP SYN act, meaning yes, it's open, it's active, and the client will acknowledge, okay, using an act flag. These are TCP flags that allows us to complete the process on the lower layers of the OSI. Now, this is the TCP transport layer. Once we completed the TCP transport layer, what will happen is the client will start initiating the HTTP request. Now, based from our previous discussion, the client here also has TCP ports, not only the server. So the client TCP port starts from 1024 to 65535. So, and this is a random. So let's say we have the client port on port 2001. And again, once the TCP three-way handshake, this TCP three-way handshake has been completed, we are now about to send, or ready to send, HTTP request from the client to the web server.